Hello, contemporary issues students. We're going to read the torture. Should torture be used against terrorist suspects? Is it ever justified? Issue number 18. We're going to look at the no side, the abolition of torture by Andrew Sullivan, beginning on page 352. Why is torture wrong? It may seem like an obvious question or even one beneath discussion, but it is now inescapably before us with the introduction of the McCain Amendment banning all cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment of detainees by American soldiers and CIA operatives anywhere in the world. The amendment lies in legislative limbo. It passed the Senate in October by a vote of 90-9, but President Bush has vowed to veto any such blanket ban on torture or abuse. Vice President Cheney has prevailed upon enough senators and congressmen to prevent the amendment and the defense appropriations bill to which it is attached from moving out of conference. And my friend Charles Krauthammer, one of the most respected conservative intellectuals in Washington and a New Republic contributing editor, has written a widely praised cover essay for the Weekly Standard endorsing the legislation of full-fledged torture by the United States under strictly curtailed conditions. We stand on the brink of an enormously important choice, one that is critical morally as well as strategically to get right. This debate takes place after 3 years in which the Bush administration has defined torture in the narrowest terms and has permitted coercive physical abuse of enemy combatants if military necessity demands it. It comes also after several internal Pentagon reports found widespread and severe abuse of detainees in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere that has led to at least 24 deaths during interrogation. Journalistic accounts and reports by International Committee of the Red Cross paint an even darker picture of secret torture sites in Eastern Europe and innocent detainees being murdered. Behind all this, the grim images of Abu Ghraib, the worst of which has yet to be released, linger in the public consciousness. In this inevitably emotional debate, perhaps the greatest failing of those of us who have been arguing against all torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment of detainees is that we have assumed the reasons why torture is always a moral evil rather than explicating them. But when you fully ponder them, I think it becomes clearer why, contrary to Krauthammer's argument, torture in any form and under any circumstances is both anti-ethical to the most basic principles for which the United States stands and a profound impediment to winning a wider war that we cannot afford to lose. Torture is the polar opposite of freedom. It is the banishment of all freedom from a human body and soul, insofar as that is possible. As human beings, we all inhabit bodies and have minds, souls, and reflexes that are designed in part to protect those bodies, to resist or flinch from pain, to protect the psyche from disintegration, and to maintain a sense of selfhood that is the basis for the concept of personal liberty. What torture does is use these involuntary, self-protective, self-defining resources of human beings against the integrity of the human being himself. It takes what is most involuntary in a person and uses it to break that person's will. It takes what is animal in us and deploys it against what makes us human. As an American commander wrote in an August 2003 email about his instructions to torture prisoners at Abu Ghraib, "The gloves are coming off, gentlemen, regarding these detainees. Colonel Bolts has made it clear that we want these individuals broken." What does it mean to break an individual? As the French essayist Michel de Montaigne once commented, and Shakespeare echoed, even the greatest philosophers have difficulty thinking clearly when they have a toothache. These wise men were describing the inescapable frailty of the human experience, mocking the claim of some seers to be above basic human feelings and bodily needs. If that frailty is exposed by a toothache, it is beyond dispute in the case of torture. The infliction of physical pain on a person with no means of defending himself is designed to render that person completely subservient to his torturers. It is designed to extirpate his autonomy as a human being, to render his control as an individual beyond his own reach. That is why the term break is instructive. Something broken can be put back together, but it will never regain the status of being unbroken, of having integrity. When you break a human being, you turn him into something subhuman. You enslave him. This is why the Romans reserved torture for slaves, not citizens, and why slavery and torture were inextricably linked in the antebellum South. What you see in the relationship between torturer and tortured is the absolute darkness of totalitarianism. You see one individual granted the most complete power he can ever hold over another, not just confinement of his mobility, the abolition of his very agency. Torture uses a person's body to remove from his own control his conscience, his thoughts, his faith, his selfhood. The CIA's definition of waterboarding, recently leaked to ABC News, describes that process in plain English. The prisoner is bound to an inclined board, feet raised and head slightly above the feet. Cellophane is wrapped over the prisoner's face and water is poured over him. Unavoidably, the gag reflex kicks in and a terrifying fear of drowning leads to almost instant pleas to bring the treatment to a halt. The ABC report then noted, according to sources, CIA officers who subjected themselves to the waterboarding technique lasted on average 14 seconds before caving in. They said Al-Qaeda's toughest prisoner, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, won the admiration of interrogators when he was able to last 2 and 2.5 minutes before begging to confess. Before the Bush administration, 2 documented cases of U.S. Armed Forces using waterboarding resulted in court-martials for the soldiers implicated. In Donald Rumsfeld's post-September 11th Pentagon, the technique is approved and we recently learned has been used on at least 11 detainees, possibly many more. What you see here is the deployment of a very basic and inescapable human reflex, the desire not to drown and suffocate in order to destroy a person's autonomy. Even the most hardened fanatic can only endure 2.5 minutes, and after that he is indeed broken. The entire structure of Western freedom grew in part out of the searing experience of state-sanctioned torture. The use of torture in Europe's religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries is still etched in our communal consciousness as it should be. Then governments deployed torture not only to uncover perceived threats to their faith-based autocracies, but also to save the victim's soul. Torturers understood that religious conversion was a difficult thing because it necessitated a shift in the deepest recesses of the human soul. The only way to reach those depths was to deploy physical terror in the hopes of completely destroying the heretic's autonomy. They would, in other words, destroy a human being's soul in order to save it. That is what burning at the stake was, an indescribably agonizing act of torture that could be ended at a moment's notice if the victim recanted. In a state where theological doctrine always trumped individual liberty, this was a natural tactic. Indeed, the very concept of Western liberty sprung in part from an understanding that if the state has the power to reach that deep into a person's soul and can do that much damage to a human being's person, then the state has extinguished all oxygen necessary for freedom to survive. That is why in George Orwell's totalitarian nightmare, the final ordeal is of course torture. Any polity that endorses torture has incorporated into its own DNA a totalitarian mutation. If the point of the U.S. Constitution is the preservation of liberty, the formal incorporation into U.S. law of the state's right to torture by legally codifying physical coercion, abuse, and even, in Krauthammer's case, full-fledged torture of detainees by the CIA, would effectively end the American experiment of a political society based on inalienable human right, freedom, protected not by the good graces of the executive, but by the rule of law. The founders understood this argument. Its preeminent proponent was George Washington himself. As historian David Hackett Fisher memorably recounts in his 2004 book, Washington's Crossing, always some dark spirits wished to visit the same cruelties on the British and Hessians that had been inflicted on the American captive. But Washington's example carried growing weight, more so than his written orders and prohibitions. He often reminded his men that they were in an army of liberty and freedom, and that the rights of humanity for which they were fighting should extend even to their enemies. Even in the most urgent moments of war, these men were concerned about the ethical questions in the Revolution. Krauthammer has described Washington's convictions concerning concerning torture as pieties that can be dispensed with today. He doesn't argue that torture is not evil. Indeed, he denounces it in unequivocal moral terms. This is a quote from Krauthammer. Torture is a terrible and monstrous thing, as degrading and morally corrupting to those who practice it as any conceivable human activity, including its moral twin, capital punishment. But he maintains that the nature of the Islamo-fascist enemy after September 11th radically altered our interrogative options, and that we are now not only permitted but actually morally compelled to torture. This is a radical and daring idea that we must extinguish human freedom in a few cases in order to maintain it for everyone else. It goes beyond even the Bush administration's own formal position, which states that the United States will not endorse torture but merely coercive interrogation techniques. Such techniques in the administration's elaborate definitions are those that employ physical force short of threatening immediate death or major organ failure. And it is based on a premise that deserves further examination, that our enemies actually deserve torture, that some human beings are so depraved, in Krauthammer's words, that they are entitled to no humane treatment. Let me state for the record that I am second to none in decrying, loathing, and desiring to defeat those who wish to replace freedom with religious tyranny of the most brutal kind, and who have murdered countless innocent civilians in cold blood. Their acts are monstrous and barbaric, but I differ from Krauthammer by believing that monsters remain human beings. In fact, to reduce them to a subhuman level is to exonerate them of their acts of terrorism and mass murder, just as animals are not deemed morally responsible for killing. Insisting on the humanity of terrorists is, in fact, critical to maintaining their profound responsibility for the evil they commit. And if they are human, then they must necessarily not be treated in an inhuman fashion. You cannot lower the moral baseline of a terrorist to the subhuman without betraying a fundamental value. That is why the Geneva Conventions have a very basic ban on cruel treatment and torture, and outrages upon personal dignity, in particular humiliating and degrading treatment, even when dealing with illegal combatants like terrorists. That is why the Declaration of Independence did not restrict its endorsement of freedom merely to those lucky enough to find themselves on U.S. soil, but extended it to all human beings, wherever they are in the world, simply because they are humans. Nevertheless, it is important to address Krauthammer's practical points. He is asking us to steel ourselves and accept that, whether we like it or not, torture and abuse may be essential in a war where our very survival may be at stake. He presents two scenarios in which he believes torture is permissible. The first is the ticking time bomb scenario, a hypothetical rarity in which the following conditions apply. A terrorist cell has planted a nuclear weapon, something nearly as devastating, in a major city. B, we have captured someone in this cell. C, we know for a fact that he knows where the bomb is. In practice, of course, the likelihood of such a scenario is extraordinarily remote. Uncovering a terrorist plot is hard enough. Capturing a conspirator involved in that plot is even harder, and realizing in advance that the person knows the whereabouts of the bomb is nearly impossible. Okay, I'll continue in just a second.